Hey there, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to Dr. Chris Frueh, who's joining us from Hawaii today. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to the next episode of the Talent Work Group Leadership Collective. So in the next hour, we're going to discuss how to better deal with change, both on a personal level and when leading your team in a professional setting. But first, a little bit about us. The Talent Work Group's Leadership Collective is a leader's guide to building elite teams and managing the most important asset on your balance sheet, which is human capital. So our team consists of some of the most experienced and proven special operations forces leaders, academics, psychologists, and business executives who understand the strategic importance of talent and human capital management. So this group has assessed, trained, selected, and developed elite winning teams, both in military and in business, ranging from smaller 6-man operations teams to 1,000-person organizations. We really do understand that it takes talent to win in any arena. No one wins in war or in business by themselves, so we enjoy sharing our experiences to empower organizations, teams, and individuals to function at an elite level and demonstrate success every single day. But we rely on your growing support, and we wouldn't be here without it. So if you like what you hear, spread your word within your organization and with your connections. And of course, you can always reach out to any member of the Leadership Collective and can even book us and work directly with your team. If you have any questions, any comments, please send them through the chat function, and we're going to do our best to address them as we move through the session. So I'm joined today by Dr. Chris Frueh, all the way from Hawaii. Chris is a PhD in clinical psychologist, professor of psychology at the University of Hawaii, and a clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. Chris has 30 years of professional experience working with military veterans and active duty personnel and has conducted clinical trials, epidemiology, historical and neuroscience research, primarily with combat veterans. He's also co-authored over 300 scientific publications, including historical analysis of Army suicides dating back to 1819 and a current graduate textbook on adult psychopathology. Chris, have I missed anything?
Tell us about yourself. You got it all.
Well, I appreciate that, Chris. My name is Dan Bradley. I'm Air Force Academy graduate and former Air Force Special Warfare Officer as a Tactical Air Control Party Officer and a Joint Terminal Attack Controller. Proud to be a part of the Talent Work Group Leadership Collective. Currently Director of Sales at Con Mechanical Contractors here in lovely Dallas, Texas. And not too far over in Austin, we're joined by Michelle. So Michelle, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Chris. And I'm excited for this session and what I get to learn from it.
All right, so we're going to jump right into talking about change and understand that first and foremost, change is uncomfortable. And even the most benign changes can be a real source of frustration. So this is a stupid, simple example, but I got to throw it in. Just last week, I was driving home on the highway and the exit I normally take was closed. I couldn't tell why, but it was. In reality, that's no big deal. You just go to the next exit and take a different route home. So it took me a few extra minutes. It wasn't really inconvenient, but it was still kind of an unwelcome shift in my evening because it was a break from what I had become used to and what I was comfortable with. So on a bit of a larger scale, in my time in the military, I served in 4 different squadrons over the course of roughly 6 years. In that time, I had 9 different commanders. That meant my boss changed on average every 8 months. And every time the commander changed, the culture of the squadron changed with them. So every time we had a change of command coming up, there was almost this sense of foreboding across the unit. Even when a commander that wasn't particularly well liked or respected was on their way out. So I found over time that I grew resistant to change, even before I could tell whether or not the change was going to be positive. So change is uncomfortable, but it's also nearly constant, At least it should be, and here's why. Change is the key ingredient to progress. If you keep doing things the way that you've always done, there isn't any room for growth. So there are people who will say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But at some point, things are going to change for the worse all by themselves due to inaction if they aren't intentionally changed for the better. And if you don't believe me, you can go ask Blockbuster why there's a documentary on Netflix about how their business model didn't change. So if we know that change is necessary, why are we afraid of it? Why are we so resistant to it? And one of the simplest and best pieces of advice I was given in the military that translated really effectively to my role in private industry is that humans are emotionally driven creatures, which simply put means we do things which we perceive to be in our own best interest. It also means that if we perceive something to be an unknown, we're generally hesitant to pursue it because the perceived change doesn't outweigh the perceived risk. In other words, when you tell somebody about a change that you're going to implement, the first thing that's going to cross their mind isn't going to be what they could gain from the outcome. It's what they're going to have to give up in the interim. It might be a degree of autonomy. It might be a sense of structure, sense of normalcy. It could be just losing time that they see as theirs. But there's going to be a reaction to that perceived loss. And people are going to resist change if they perceive it as a nuisance or if they don't understand the intent behind it. But those same people are going to buy into it much more readily if they believe the change reflects their best interests. It's that simple. That boils down to communication and how effectively you're messaging the reasons for the change, rather than just messaging the change itself. So with change in any setting, whether personal or professional, recognize that it's uncomfortable. It's an emotional experience that impacts the trust and the confidence of those around you. Done the right way, leading your team through a period of change can be a bonding experience that helps build trust and confidence throughout an organization. So as a leader, it's really your responsibility to build a vision, set a course, communicate how the change is positive for those it impacts, address concerns, and ultimately follow through on solidifying that change into your team's culture moving forward. So anchoring the change is that last step, but it's one of the most important. You don't want to go through all that work to implement a change, get to the final stages, and have it wash away. Just one point here before I throw it over to Dr. Frueh. You can pull a ton of perspective on this directly from the way that some of the most elite echelons of the military assess and select their personnel, because buried within this leadership issue is a talent issue. So change requires some features within a team. It's adaptability, creativity, patience, there's plenty more, but those fall within the realm of talents and attributes, not necessarily skills. So those are things you can't really teach. If you have to identify, you do have to identify that in your screening process, because if you don't deal with it while you're selecting the team that you're getting set to lead, you're going to pay for it when you're leading the team you've selected. So Chris, let me pass this your way. If change is an uncomfortable thing, what role does stress play in all of this?
Sure. Well, let's start with the physiological aspect here. And let's be very mindful. I think we have a tendency to think of change as something, oh, we want this. I want to get married. I want to move to this new city. I want to take this new job. So much of what we experience in our own personal lives are changes that we choose. And we often do this with like, well, this is something I want, so it shouldn't be difficult. But in fact, really any kind of change is a challenge for us. And I want to talk about a very famous endocrinologist from the mid 20th century, a fellow named Hans Selye, taught in pretty much every single Psych 100 class, his general adaptation syndrome about stress. And for Selye, he thought it was change. Change was the major stressor that humans experience. And his definition of this, and I'm just going to quote this, is the non-specific response of the body to any demand made upon it. So we can relate this right back to allostatic load. The more changes, the more things we have going on around us, the harder it can be. One of the things that Selye created was what he called the general adaptation syndrome, where we go through three phases with change and stress. So the first one is alarm, where our bodies are going, whoa, what's going on here? This is not feeling good. This doesn't feel right. And that's very much a physiological response. It's not specific because we have different we have different vulnerabilities and different risk factors and different responses as individuals. But for CELI, and I guess for us, for our purposes here, we're talking about changes in hormonal secretions, the HPA axis, the adrenal, corticoid systems. So there's a lot of physiological changes that go on. That gets kicked off with the alarm. After the alarm phase, we go into a resistance phase where we try to accommodate and fix things. And if we can't, eventually we get into the final stage, which is exhaustion. We literally kind of just reach the end of our resources, and we're tired, both physically tired. Our immune system is not functioning as well. We're not sleep. We tend to not sleep as well. So all of these things, these physiological changes, we're vulnerable to when we hit stress. So I think, Dan, I'll send it back. I'll turn it back over to you. But answer this. But think about this question: are leaders, and that includes people, leadership at the top, but also middle management and middle leaders, how compassionate are we being? How empathic are we? How aware and sensitive are we to the changes, to the effects on changes to our talent personnel?
Well, Chris, it's interesting. You brought up that everybody has their own kind of ability to adjust to change, and part of that is just who they are. It's inherent in them, right? So as leaders, when we decide we're going to go implement a change, we already think it's a great idea. I'm not going to bring a change to my team and lead a change initiative not thinking that it's the best idea in the world. So I don't have to convince me.
Right.
But if I take that change initiative and put the onus on communicating it, leading it, checking up on it on myself, I'm probably not going to have a great understanding or be super acknowledging of the stress that I'm putting other people under.
And you may not be aware of it.
Exactly. And Chris, you and I were joined by Lisa Jaster not too long ago on one of these about communication. And the big point about communication is you don't know how well you're communicating or how poorly you're communicating until you've already encountered an issue because of it. So if you're not communicating it effectively to each level that's affected or impacted by the change initiative, or that's carrying some of the load of that change initiative, I would assume that you're putting some people in a pretty bad position.
Hey, maybe before we get into talking about some of the specific leadership and organizational strategies, maybe I could just toss in one other little piece here. There's an interesting and old, it's been around a long time, stress scale that people might consider, and it's titled the Holmes-Rahe. Holmes as in Sherlock, Rahe, R-A-H-E. So it's the Holmes-Rahe Life Stress Inventory, the Social Readjustment Rating Scale. And this is a really simple scale. It's just a list of about 50 events, almost 50 events, 43 on my questionnaire here. And you just circle each event that you have experienced recently. And usually that time frame is the past year. And then there's a point value for each event or each experience. And simply you add up the points. And if your points are above a certain point, Holmes and Rahe said you had a lot of stress on you. So I'll just real quickly walk through a little bit of this. So the top, number one, is death of a spouse, and that's 100 points. Number two, divorce. That's 73 points. Now we get down a little bit, down at number 8. This is where we get to things involving the workplace. Being fired, 47 points. So look at that. Being fired at work is half the stress of having your spouse pass away. Retirement is 45 points. That's just a couple notches below. Any kind of major business readjustments is at number 15. That's 39 points, and on and on. So there's about 10 different things on this scale that relate to the workplace. So changes at work are going to load up a lot of points on somebody's life stress inventory score. Over to you, Dan. Let's talk about some of the things now that good leaders can do to mitigate and facilitate.
Well, Chris, one of the things that's interesting about that is retirement is a pretty significant stressor. Now, when I think about retirement, I imagine when most people think about retirement, you don't really anticipate it being a stressor. Is it still contributing to that because it's just a change and it's just different, even though it's a positive thing that I would say most professionals are striving to accomplish?
Well, retirement is actually, I think, is extraordinarily stressful for many people. And I think you can almost see it in a lot of people who retire who don't have a plan. So what you often, I mean, if we want to talk about retirement, oftentimes people retire, they have a fantasy, but not a plan. And the fantasy is, oh, days playing golf, sleeping in, parties, travel. But how long can you do that? After 3 months, do you still want to be doing those things? Some people do. I think many people, though, need more than that. People start to miss the mission, the purpose, the identity that work gave them and that they had through their careers.
Absolutely makes sense. Now, guys, as we start to move into the conversation aspect of this, go ahead and throw your comments up. Any questions you've got regarding change initiatives, any questions about our experience in dealing with what's right and what's wrong and how to not go about this, throw in your comments and kind of help encourage the conversation. We're always happy to address any questions you have. So one of the things that I've always found to be really, really important in the early stages of any change initiative is the why. So we always talk about start with why, tell people the why, over communicate the why. If you don't do that, one of the things that you're going to encounter in driving this change initiative, whatever it may be, is people are going to question why that why was left out. So a couple of things might come across their head. You might get, this is change for the sake of change because, I remember in the military, it was always someone needed a bullet for their performance report. So we're going to initiate this change so that the boss man so-and-so can get his bullet and say, this is what I've accomplished. If you don't communicate that why, people will insert their own why based on assumptions, and assumptions are almost always false. So don't hesitate to over communicate the reason for the why. And one of the more important things to do in that process is build a sense of urgency and associate that sense of urgency with the change, because that eliminates the entire conversation about, I don't know why we're doing this. If you attach a solid outcome, both positive and negative, to what could come of this change initiative. If there's no sense of urgency, there's no evidence that change is necessary at all. I'm not saying go out and manufacture a crisis and tell your team that the company is burning, and if we don't do this right now, we're going to end up in a horrible spot. But build that sense of urgency. Give your team realistic, important, and pressing reasons that the change that you're trying to initiate is necessary.
And Dan, if I could just chime in, I think it's not only important to explain why, but to be transparent about it. Show the data, provide the information to people so that in a very transparent sort of way, so that people aren't left with that sneaking suspicion that you're deceiving them in order to bring about some change for some other reason.
Once you've kind of built that why and given the data and helped show the reason that you're going to institute this change and put everybody in an uncomfortable position, how important is it to actually empower your team to have ownership of the change initiative? How important is it to give them not just the responsibility for driving it, but the credit for the outcomes?
I've worked in a number of organizations where, and I'm thinking of one very particular, pretty dire situation in 2008, where one of the organizations I worked for was facing a massive change to their business model thanks to the recession at the time. And what the president of the organization did was he took it back to the employees. He took it back to all of us and said, listen, folks, he opened the books. He showed us some numbers. This is where we're at. And we could all see, we could see the decline in business. I mean, it was obvious. It was apparent, visibly apparent to everybody who worked in the organization. So he put it back to us, created a committee, and the committee didn't have any decision-making authority, but it was tasked with come up with some solutions, brainstorm some ideas, come up with a variety of things for us as the top leadership to consider. And that worked pretty effectively. What helped it was having a deadline we're contemplating change. It's going to be significant. We know this is stressful. There's not going to be a good outcome for every single employee. We're going to have to make some reductions. And that was known, it was understood, and they set a deadline. So when the deadline came, they ripped the Band-Aid off and they announced the plan to the whole organization at the same time. Everybody heard the same message at the same time. So there was no rumor mill at that point going around. And then it was, within a few months, things were kind of on an even keel in terms of the people who remained and the reorganization that had been implemented.
Now, Chris, one of the things that you finished that off with is the people that remain, or what the organization looks like at the point where the change is more or less complete, where you're getting to that anchoring the change in the culture stage. So one of the things that I want to address is Matthew Feely just posted this question: how do you deal with acute resistance from employees? And I think that tangentially relates to what you were just talking about. So resistance is something you're going to encounter. It's not a maybe, it's going to happen. No matter how minute the change is, no matter how quickly you can institute it, there are always going to be dissenters. One thing you have to understand is, if you can get ahead of the issue and you can over-communicate, and I know I keep over-communicate, but if you can over-communicate that in the early stages, you're far less likely to see that when you're getting into the meat of the changes you're trying to institute. But if somebody is dead set against the direction that you're trying to take your team, it's a pretty fair indicator that they're not right for your team. And keep in mind that that's not a negative reflection on them. It's also not a negative reflection on you. It's kind of just the way it is. It's an indication that there isn't the degree of alignment within your team or within your organization that you're going to need to institute that change effectively. Chris, how have you seen this play out in the past, and how have you handled it?
Well, I've never been the top guy making those kinds of big decisions, but I've been maybe the number 2 or 3 guy a few times. And I think the leadership at the mid-levels is important, as well as the leadership at the top. I mean, you know this from your service. I think a good leader at this point is going to have to be open to engagement and listening. Doesn't mean agreeing with everything, but hearing everybody, being empathic to everybody, being seen to be empathic. Even if you're empathic but people don't see it, I think you're going to have a messaging difficulty with that.
So I'd argue that in this case, or a case like that, it's not necessarily about the change. It's about the leadership. So it's about generating buy-in early on and proving to your team that they can trust you over time. Because in this case, trust is what actually wins. You can build it by proving that change is beneficial. You can institute small wins along the way, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But if you can prove this in their best interest, and that you have their best interest at the forefront of your mind in instituting this change, you might have a little bit more success when it comes to building trust long term.
And I think if you've been engaging your employees along the way, you'll be a few steps ahead. And we have a nice comment here from Jeffrey Bruno, saying that he's found success preparing his teams to have a change-ready, quote, change-ready mindset prior to the change, so that the initial response is more positive than negative. That's preparing your team for what's to come, and I think that's very valuable.
We just had another question come in from Timothy Max Bassett. How do you adjust your strategy when approaching your team in the civilian sector, where the motivation and camaraderie may be lacking? Let me dispel a little bit of some of the perspective about civilian versus private sector, private sector versus military. In my experience in the military, there's always been an assumption that teams are automatically aligned, that everybody is best buds with everybody and we're all working towards the same goal. And for the most part, that's true, but not always. I've worked on some teams that were really high performing, really carefully built, very cautiously selected, and still encountered motivation and camaraderie issues. I would say that issue translates very directly. I would say that the way you handle it might not from the military to private sector. For me, when it comes to adjusting strategy, there's a couple different approaches you can take. One is, like Chris was talking about, having an understanding of a person's individual needs. Going back to one of our previous podcasts again about communication, when you're communicating responsibly and effectively, it's not about how you prefer to communicate. It's about how the person who's the receiver prefers to receive information. So if you can communicate the change to them in a way that's much more effective, that they're much more receptive to, you might have a better opportunity to build up that camaraderie or build up their motivation. I think that strategy is one of those really neat things that you can put a lot of time into developing and planning out, but no strategy, no plan survives initial contact with the enemy. And in some of these cases, the change initiative, the enemy itself is your team. That doesn't mean you should look at them as the enemy, but they're the ones who are going to be throwing a wrench in your plans. So I think it comes down to an individual basis. If those things are lacking, I wouldn't go straight to saying this person's not aligned and we need to do something about it. Chris, talk a little bit about how the role of the individual and how their mindset coming to that change initiative influences how you might approach it.
Well, I mean, we've got a good comment or question in the chat box from Matthew Feely. How do you deal with acute resistance from employees? And I've seen this. I've been one of the acute resistors myself before. And so let me go to that experience. Why was I an acute resistor at one point? And it was because I didn't trust, didn't believe leadership. I didn't see the reason for the changes that they were pushing, and those reasons were not really explained. Well, they weren't explained. They were just kind of done. And maybe a one-sentence explanation was provided, but that won't work. You're good, talented people. You don't want people who are lemmings. You want people who will ask the tough questions. So I think when I was an acute resistor, I started off as a skeptic, and I asked questions and wasn't given satisfactory answers. So then I became the acute resistor. I think for management, that's a really important point to be mindful of. Yes, you're not going to make everybody happy. Yes, there will be people who will need to leave. But do you want to spoil the morale of everybody who remains in the process of doing that? So I think that's why the value of a change mindset is really really important. But you only get there if you have transparent explanations and reasons for why you're making those changes. So from a leader, what are you going to do with some of these issues? And I think it's just important to listen, to give people a chance to ask the questions, to not blame or judge people for asking tough questions. I've seen this happen positively. I've seen it happen negatively, and effectively and not effectively. That's probably a better way to put it. Being mindful of the physiological stress, the chemical changes, the physiological changes that people are experiencing, I think is important. Imagine your whole workforce, imagine your whole team, Dan, knowing change is coming. Everybody fears for their job, fears for their finances. Some people maybe not sleeping, maybe not eating well, maybe not exercising, maybe not invoking whatever their lifestyle, healthy lifestyle habits are. Is that the team is that how you want your team to be? Ask yourself that question. And what's left after you make the changes?
No, Chris, that's a fantastic point. And I've been there, right? I've had those times where automatically when I hear a change is coming, my first reaction is being that resistor. Sometimes
here we go again.
Yeah, sometimes not so acute to it either. But that's kind of the point, is that there we go again mentality. If it's constant change, if it's a new commander every 8 months, the second you get to know a guy, he's out the door. If it's your company is restructuring constantly and not allowing time for these changes to be anchored, to be set, and to see how it plays out, there's going to be a point where the change gets to be too much. And when you do factor in all of those individual, personal, just life events, things that are just happening completely outside of the office, completely outside of your team, that are impacting how your team is functioning, if you just ignore that as a leader, you are setting yourself up for failure right from the get-go. So there's change going on in all of our lives, both in the office and out of the office. You can't change things constantly and just expect your team to keep up with it. They're eventually going to get to the point where they're just fed up. And on top of that, if change is just this unending part of your business, it kind of gives the hint that it's not super well thought out. It's almost like a knee-jerk reaction for sweeping changes. And people are going to get tired of that too. That's one of those things that's going to break down trust. When you talk about resistors, Chris, in your opinion, what are some other things that are going to automatically drive your team to be averse to the change?
Well, I think poor communication. One of the things that poor communication does is it allows people to use their imagination, and then they start talking with each other. So I think keeping a handle on the water cooler conversations, so to speak, is pretty important. Being aware of what people are thinking and feeling. Again, I think as a leader, being open to listen. And that can mean something as simple as wandering around and just sitting in people's offices and inviting them to talk, or holding town hall meetings, or even the hallway conversations that can really be important. Matthew Feely has a good point here. He writes in our chat box, I think the resistors may help fine-tune change and really whittle down the ideas being brought forward. That's when you have good leadership that's open to that. So resistors can become your strong allies if their difficult questions are addressed in a manner that's effective and transparent.
So I guess to boil that down, Chris, it's about being receptive to the feedback that you are receiving.
Yes, and showing that you're listening, so active listening, empathic listening. But again, listening doesn't mean you're going to agree with everything or be able to deliver everything. And so I think it's important for people to feel heard, and then to get some honest feedback along as part of that, so that they're not surprised or stunned when the final changes are announced.
And that's something I've encountered a couple times over the course of both my time in the military and in the civilian sector, is people tend to sugarcoat changes as if that's going to just build more buy-in. If you sugarcoat it, I don't feel that you're doing anybody any favors. If you need to restrict spending, if you're going to need to make cuts, if you're going to need to conserve resources, whatever the case is, you're not helping anybody on your team out by holding that information back, or by painting the change initiative as something that's not. Frankly, I'd say that's disrespectful to your team.
It is. And that's the worst thing you can do, is allow anybody you're trying to lead, as well as your peers, as well as your horizontal colleagues, that you're disrespecting people. And the problem with that is there will be the post-change period. And so what's going to predict effectiveness post-change is the level of engagement and morale of your employees, of your talent. So it's really important to handle this process well.
Now, Chris, I'm feeling that we're getting close to tying up this conversation, and the intent here is not to give a cover-all sweeping assessment on how to lead change the right way, and do it our way, and you'll expect results. In any team, results may differ, and your experience may vary. But when you talk about the end of the change initiative, when you've reached kind of the goal that you were trying to accomplish, and people are starting to become more set in their ways, one of the things that I've frequently encountered is that people are going to tend to revert to their old habits, whether they intend to or not. So it might not be something that they're doing to be malicious about it, or to say, I like the old way better. It might just be human nature. So from my perspective, I've always seen that when you consider the change accomplished, that's the time where you really have to push harder than at any previous time, keeping in mind that your team is looking to get back to normal, whether that's the old normal or the new normal. We have this desire to revert to old patterns, old behaviors, old habits. Out of your experience, Chris, and drawing on your experience with how people actually think, how people actually behave, what are some effective ways to really anchor that change in the culture of your organization?
Well, I don't know that there's anything really we haven't already talked about. Explaining the why, being transparent about it, being empathic in your listening and your discussions, inviting your employees to be engaged in part of the discussion, maybe even part of the decision-making process, and then implementing the change in a way that's open and transparent. Probably all change at once. And we can maybe think about whether incremental changes are better or all at once changes. It probably depends on the situation, of course. But in a dire situation like the one we faced in 2008, we had to make a very immediate, very rapid, and very dramatic changes to the organization, which meant in the end, it led to about a 25% staff reduction, which was hard. It was painful and it hurt. But within about a month afterwards, the people who were 75% of the employees who were still there was a pretty good sense of, hey, we had to do this. We did the right thing. We did it in the right way, and the morale of the organization was really good. And that's what it took, I think, to pull the organization through that difficult year.
Well, Chris, thank you for that. Right now, I'm going to welcome Michelle back on in. And guys, it's time for saved rounds. So, Chris, if you've got anything that you want to leave and wrap up on, now would be the time.
Well, I want to paraphrase Machiavelli. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's one of my favorite parts, extracts from his book, The Prince. And he talks about maybe the prince is evil, maybe the prince is benevolent. Doesn't matter. When it comes to change in the kingdom, what Machiavelli recommended is that the prince be ruthless but transparent and make all the change at once, if it's going to be a large change, so that afterwards everybody who is left, and of course Machiavelli may have been talking about assassinating dukes and princes and other royalty in his book, but once the princes made the decision of the changes and implemented them, do it all together so that afterwards people aren't looking over their shoulder feeling nervous and insecure for a significant period of time afterwards. Over to you.
Well, Chris, my final point isn't quite as Machiavellian or academic, but I will say that I find so often, both in military and in private industry, that the skill of just understanding your people and of responding to them the way they need to be responded to is frequently lost. It's often called soft skills. Not a fan of the term, but I think we all understand what that really means. Having an understanding of what your people actually need in the moment, and understanding that need is going to change as whatever change initiative you're trying to institute is going to adjust. Be ready to meet your people where they are. It's way easier to walk alongside them than to pull them or push them. It's more effective, and you can't build trust with someone that you're not standing next to. So, Michelle, let's welcome you back in. What do you have for us?
Yeah, so the first point that I got was that change is the ingredient to progress, and it is uncomfortable, but it is unavoidable. And so wrapping it up, I think the main takeaway was that the main key to leading through change is trust. Your team must trust you that whatever may happen, even though change is scary, it's unavoidable and you need it to progress. Your team needs a leader that they can rely on and they know that has their back no matter what.
Very, very well said, Michelle. All right, guys, we've touched on this. Expect a little bit coming out of the Talent War Group Leadership Collective's blogs, that will expound on this topic and give you a little bit more information. And guys, as always, keep following and feel free to reach out and engage with any member of the Talent War Group's Leadership Collective at any time. So I'm going to go ahead and plug our next session. We've got Tuesday, May 12th, so next Tuesday. It is going to be at a new time, 4 p.m. Eastern, 5 Central, and it's going to be on strategies for post-vaccination working. Sorry, Chris?
I think you meant the other way around, 5 Eastern, 4 Central.
Good thing we have a doctor on. I appreciate that, Chris. So that's going to be hosted by former Green Beret Tom Hall, also a member of the Leadership Collective. And guys, I would not want you to miss out on this. Check out the Jedburgh podcast hosted by Frueh Riccioppi. His latest episode is with an executive search and consulting firm in the cannabis industry. You can find him on iTunes, Spotify, just about anywhere podcasts are. That is one of the highlights of my day when Frank comes out with something new. He's had some fantastic guests, and he's always speaking very succinctly to what the point is about how this can impact your business, your approach, and of course, your skills to lead. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. Like I said, if you like what you heard and you want to continue the conversation, reach out and connect with us. LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Share our posts and the posts of these sessions with anybody in your organization, your team, your connections, your family, your friends. There's nobody that you shouldn't be sharing it with if you're seeing value in it. If you want to improve yourself, your team, your organization, any of our team members are always available to work with you directly to find success. And again, you can book us on thetalentwar.com to work with you independently. Check out thetalentwargroup.com for some more. And with that, we'll sign off. Everybody have a great Wednesday.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Chris.